Yeah, okay, welcome very much to this, the second segment we've done with our guest, and that's Josep Blasi, and he is a professor and concerned with questions of economics and also social justice in a major way. We had done an hour earlier with Herb that we aired at an earlier date, but we're now picking up on that, and Joseph, welcome back to Conversations and to our discussion.
Thank you very much.
We were talking about Louis Calstone, about the broad question of ownership and the history of that in our country and so forth. And it's a question that is still before us, even though the ideas have been there. There are ideas that ought to be brought into up on the table of policy decision makers in terms of how we're going to proceed to deal with the questions that are before us now in a major way. The questions you're raising really have great import in terms of the organization of world society, national and world society.
Well, economic inequality is right now arguably the top social policy problem in the United States today.
What about and the world?
And also in the world.
Okay, yeah.
And also in the world, because as I said in the last in the last program, the concentration of wealth, the concentration of ownership of stock and bonds, the concentration of ownership of technology, the access to capital income and capital gains on that ownership is concentrated right at the very top, not only in the U.S., but in the world. In fact, the U.S. is worse in its concentration and march towards feudalism than many third world countries.
It's really quite. What does that tell us? I wonder.
That tells us that we haven't figured out how to update the idea of many of the founders of the American Revolution. To sort of go back and summarize a little bit about what the book says. That you need broad-based property ownership for people to have economic liberty and economic independence and to be able to support themselves. They tried to do that with land up until the Homestead Act, and then the idea was to do that with shares of corporations, profit sharing, employee stock ownership plans. And we need to figure out how to update this idea of the citizen share to the modern world, not only in the United States.
To everybody?
But sure, everybody.
Ultimately, and also with an inclusion of the ecology that is called for now by our increasing capability to affect things.
Sure, and I think one of the things we need to ask ourselves is how can we do this in an environmentally sustainable way?
And what's preventing us from what has prevented us from doing that in terms of our intellectual commitment to past patterns, reified institutions, or what? Why have we had such a difficult time coming up with this crucial question of how to organize what Bucky Fuller would have called an operating manual for spaceship Earth that relates to the future? What's been the holdup?
Well, excuse me. First of all, let me be clear. It's not that we don't have any of this. Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
We cite a survey in our book where we show that about 18% of the U.S. population owns stock in the companies where they live, where they work and
something,
live. Yeah, that's something. And some of them, as in Google or important companies like Procter & Gamble, those ownership shares are very significant.
Are those companies that have that, are they doing better by some indicators that can be cited than those that don't? Or is that
our research suggests that on average, those companies are have better economic performance on average, and I want to get into that later. But I want to just want to emphasize in answering your question about what we should do. That we have models that exist today at all levels of the economy. We have companies like Google that have broad-based employee ownership and profit sharing that's quite significant for the workers' welfare.
Throughout the whole organization.
Throughout the whole organization.
As well as the leaders, the CEOs and stuff.
We have manufacturing and huge marketing organizations like Procter & Gamble. You know, they own Gillette, Crest, and Bounty, and all these consumer products where they have profit sharing and broad-based employee ownership. Procter & Gamble may be as much as 20% owned by its employees. We have this whole sector of 10,000 ESOP companies, mostly medium and small businesses that people see in their communities that are owned.
Narrowly held, many of them?
They're owned mostly by employee stock ownership plans.
Oh, right, okay, right.
100% or more than 51% owned by employee stock ownership plans. Some ESOPs are really big, like Public Supermarkets in Florida, 100% owned by its employees.
They had Weird and Steel, and they had some others that were done really big deals and everything like that for a while.
Sure. Unfortunately, in the case of Weirton, sometimes a related concept was used to rescue a failing firm, but that's not really a good idea when industry is collapsing. But W.L. Gore, the maker of Gore-Tex and those products, that's a majority worker-owned firm. So I do want to emphasize, both in the closely held sector of small business and when you get to these sort of large companies, not just tech companies, but companies like Procter & Gamble, we have it. The question is, your question, why don't we have a lot more? And
what's held us up?
What's held us up? I think one of the things that has held us up is the belief that somehow, and some of this is a belief held by some policymakers and some in the social science, the economics profession, the belief that somehow it's not doable. That somehow we can't figure out ways better than the current market has figured out ways to do this. Now, in our book, we talk about these models of Google and Procter & Gamble and ESOPs, and we say we have these corners of the society. For example, one specific idea that I've heard that I find particularly upsetting and of concern is that because there's a perfect market, workers are paid what they should be paid. Right? Their wages have sought the market, the market level, so that if you provided, if a corporation which didn't have employee ownership shares or profit sharing decided to provide them, this argument says that they would have to reduce the wages of workers. Sounds maybe okay, but the thing is, we have a lot of examples. For example, the entire ESOP sector in the United States, we have research indicating that they tend to pay their wages above the average market wage. Plus, their workers have significant stock ownership, in many cases averaging about $200,000 per worker. And on top of that, they tend to have a separate diversified pension plan. Now, according to this economic theory, that should be impossible. You shouldn't be able to see that. Or that Procter & Gamble, for example, and Google, which pays their workers generally fair fixed wages, and then they have profit sharing and significant stock ownership stakes on top of that. This theory would suggest that's not possible. So what's going on here? What's the gap?
That's interesting in a large sense. You know, I wonder if we can think about these in a large sense. But you go ahead and develop it. I got thoughts on it.
I think what's going on here in a large sense is that putting sort of my research hat on. My colleagues Doug Kruse and Richard Freeman and I have collected over 100 studies on broad-based shares, profit and equity sharing, and found that on average, economic performance increases. So what explains why you can have an ESOP company, Procter & Gamble or Google, that pays more? It's not that they're philanthropists, it's not that they're doing charity, it's that the pie gets bigger when you have employees who have an economic share and are engaged and committed to solving the problems of the business. And we have a lot of economic research on this.
Could be that principle, or axiomatically almost, could be added to a society or to a world society.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it underscores again your grounding with your good Jesuit background of justice and so forth that could be addressed, and also it can be seen in what is systems terms. You can understand things in systems terms better now. The whole evolution of things, and we again, in the earlier program we did, I referred to Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov wrote all the rules of robotics. And it's interesting to me because we've been watching Google and YouTube and all the great things that are going and affecting information tech, the internet itself, all of these kind of things, that's growing. But what's going on now also is it's not only just the information, it's robotics. Robotics are coming and they can produce with great efficiency 50,000 pairs of shoes in an hour or something, and you don't even need labor input to it. I mean, it's just all being done on automatic. and it's also creating a situation that affects the overall condition of the world. Apparently we've been here, I don't know how you feel about it or what your research is, we've been here about 200,000 years, our species, on this planet. And when we emerged out of the cave in Africa, apparently we're all African, all the resources were here. I mean, I like Henry George, the resource-based economy, or
Sure.
the Zeitgeist movement and other kinds of things. But all the resource, the oil was here, the land, all that and everything. And we had a liaison with mankind's ability to take and extend his consciousness through tools and technology and make the environment, take advantage of resources, develop them, and make the world different than in an Eden-like sense is the way most creatures are embedded in the nature. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand.
So we've gone through 10,000 generations, and Mr. Asimov said, this is not just your normal thing, like the feudalism to this, or the Republicans or Democrats, or the tax spending, or what. This is the defining generation in existentially significant new terms. We're coming to the end. It could be seen, it may be too dramatic, we may be coming to the end of what has been the Homo sapien experience.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that. I don't think I'm able to comment on that broader issue.
Well,
but in terms of this being a defining
moment in not just historical terms, but in significant, existentially significant new terms.
Sure.
One of the characteristics of which is always throughout all of history in terms of measuring, if you talk about haves and have-nots, what do we mean by a have in material terms? How do we define that, their capability? The percentage of the world population that is throughout time has been, that it could be seen to be a have, has been going up. It comes into the modern 20th century only hyperbolic, and then it begins to go exponential itself. The percentage of the world population in terms of our capability, the future, the capability that we have, has been going up in terms of the higher percentage of the world population. We may actually have transcended, at the level of capability, material scarcity.
Well, I think
which throws into a cocked hat all of the assumptions of the past institutional structure that's
Sure.
been built. So we may be coming to a thing where there is enough for all, which there never has been. So in all of history, these institutions are reified all around us, are outdated in a major way, and we have a liaison with the future that we need vision to the future that is qualitatively different than that which we've inherited out of all our institutions. So that may be why we're having
sure.
difficulty.
So
I don't know. That's
well,
just
when you have these paradigm shifts, you do have
paradigm of paradigms.
Yes, you do have a difficulty. So let me suggest what the shift needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
If, as I believe Louis Kelso predicted, you're stating, a lot of modern economists now are now saying,
scratching their head,
that we're approaching a situation where capital instruments, technology, automation, robotics, massively increased productivity as a result of
productiveness, I would say.
As a result of technology, can create a lot of what we need. Then it becomes clear that the citizens who own all of those instruments, let's call it capital, who own those factories, own those robots, right?
Those resources.
And they will be the wealthy citizens.
And they will be everybody.
Well, no, they won't be everybody.
They can be. You can transcend.
They can be everybody.
Yeah, but they haven't been able to be
under
historically.
The current way that things are organized, they are not.
That's right.
They are not everybody.
Because we're reified institutions that were the reality, the ontologic reality was one that has been transformed by the development evolutionarily of the world economy.
They are not everybody. So imagine two scenarios. Imagine a scenario where the whole United States moves towards wind and solar energy.
Well, okay, that would be something, yeah.
And imagine one scenario where a bunch of companies were set up with professional managers that got credit and borrowed capital to buy those
turbines or
to buy those wind turbines, to buy those solar energy cells, and those companies borrowed money on behalf of a trust for workers and citizens, and the shares in those companies were owned by workers and citizens.
Right.
Okay, so they would be consumers and owners, and they would get maybe lower energy costs. Plus, they would receive capital ownership and dividends from these companies.
Over a reasonable period. How long does it take for an investment to pay for itself?
Well, I think it depends what the technology you're talking about is.
Well, no,
so I don't want to give an average number.
No, you don't have we don't have a general. Lewis used to say it would pay for itself in maybe 5, 6, 7 years, something like that.
An average ESOP is
not an ESOP, but in the economy itself.
Yeah, well, I think. I'm talking about an ESOP. When workers have bought a company, either a manufacturing or service company with an ESOP, I'd say 5 to 15 years it pays.
5 to 15 years.
Itself. But what I want to do is contrast this way of organizing solar and wind energy with another way where a few corporations. And there's nothing wrong with corporations. These other are corporations too. There are a few corporations that are owned narrowly, say by 5 or 10% of the population.
As is the case in the trend.
As in the case right now. Own all of the solar energy and wind energy, and the rest of the population are just sort of paying these energy bills, as it were.
That's right.
And they're not owners. But more importantly,
their means of participating as workers is being undercut from under them.
Sure, and more importantly is robotics. Because if robotics and computing power, if robotics and computing power are largely owned by a very small group or by corporations that are owned by 5 or 10% of the population.
How is the population going to get money to buy what can be produced?
Now, we have this argument that many economists make, which is that fine, a current factory that makes car batteries, for example, once you put robotics into it, those workers will become software engineers, or they'll be installing solar energy, or they'll become service workers. Unfortunately, I think we've seen pretty clearly that in many cases, those jobs are lower wage jobs with poor benefits, or those jobs go offshore. I guess what I'm saying is, when you begin this conversation asking, what is the crucial idea transformation? I think we have to get our heads around the fact that we are not going to replace. We used to call it in Scranton, Pennsylvania, working for the post office. Your wages increase every year, and your pension plan increases every year. We're not going to replace the jobs that were lost in the economy with those working for the post office kinds of jobs in the future. We probably are going to have, I don't like it, I'm not supporting it, we probably are going to have fairly flat, adjusted for inflation, wages. And so if we don't figure out a way to make the middle class owners of capital in a private market economy, that we are going to have feudalism.
You're going to have political discord even beyond that so obvious today.
And it becomes
dangerous.
Well, it becomes dangerous for a number of reasons. Think of the debate between the Republican and Democratic Party. The Republican Party largely against increasing taxes and against expanding the social support, social welfare system.
The public sector stuff.
The Democratic Party more supportive of the public sector, of increasing taxes, expanding the social welfare system. When you don't have citizens who have broad property ownership that they can use to support themselves in addition to their wages, that debate becomes a crazy debate. Because the Republicans end up not having an answer to economic inequality, and the Democrats end up where their only answer is expanding the welfare state, and it's untenable. I want to make
you want to have
statement.
something that has both.
Yes, I want to make a very clear.
Even Naomi Klein says you got to have a mixed economy. She doesn't want all one or the other. They tried that in the Soviet Union; it didn't work out very well.
I want to make it very clear. With the increasing share of technology and robotics to productiveness, with the direction of inflation-adjusted wages, we will not be able to sustain increasing a tax system and a social support system to compensate.
Under the current trend.
Compensate for that.
Right.
So I think the way to do this is not to take one or the other. It's not to sort of throw away having a social support system.
Right.
It's to have a reasonable, fair, and just system of social support, but also provide the population with an opportunity to acquire property ownership.
Acquire income-producing property ownership that gives them income to lead a life that they would like to lead.
Yes, this is.
It might be they're going to have to get involved with some things that haven't counted for much, like art and poetry and the things that really matter, the goods of civilization, rather than just be wage slaves.
Absolutely.
Doing something that they have to do only to get money and they're not really invested in.
My image of the future is
liberation and renaissance.
My image of the future, sure.
Yeah.
My image of the future is. Robotics factories.
Yeah, turning out all kinds of good stuff.
Where the factory is actually owned by the workers.
Everybody.
Well, right now I'm talking about owned by the workers.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, the hours worked per week are reduced.
Yeah.
The workers have an income from the productiveness of the robotics.
What they want to do.
And, well, hopefully that time can be spent working, but doing work that maybe the population doesn't want to pay for.
Well, they don't.
Like helping senior citizens.
Right.
Like helping disabled children.
Or the arts.
Like the environment.
The
or the
arts are treated so shabbily. Or research, or learning, and this kind of thing. Or taking care of children in a good, loving way within a family structure where you got some time to be able to pay attention, rather than going out and picking up papers and some sort of a thing that keeps you wage slave.
But look, imagine the situation where a very small part of the population owns these robotics factories.
We're going to be in deep doo-doo.
Well, wait. Let me spin it out.
Okay.
And the people who are working for lower wages and worse benefits. Under that scenario, they do not have the leisure for generous social service work.
No, they would be reduced to like a serf on a feudal estate.
Yeah. So we are headed towards feudalism, and we should be clear. Once we reach a feudalism structure of our economy, and we're getting close to that, with 10% typically owning more than 80 or 90% of many things in the economy. We're getting very close to that. Once that happens, then our democracy becomes more form rather than substance. And James Madison worried about this, and so did President John Adams. Their view was that political parties in such a representative democracy would come up with all kinds of slogans to manipulate property-less citizens, because they would be moved by emotion, by slogans and emotion and anger,
and manipulated by public relations companies that can make them dance like a puppet.
So what I'd like to do now is if I can, bring this down to a level of specificity.
Okay,
what specifically can the government change? So I want to give several suggestions.
Okay.
First of all, as I said, the main idea of our book is that the founders thought.
And again, the book is called the Citizen Share ownership, putting ownership back into the into human relations, or into democracy. Sorry.
Okay. The principal idea of the book is that many of the founders had a specific policy to address economic inequality, and it was broad-based property ownership. So how could we get more of that? And they did this for many, many decades by encouraging Homestead Act-like opportunities for people to have independent farmland to support themselves. So what I'd like to see is the following kinds of policies. First of all, a corporation does not receive corporate tax incentives unless it has a broad-based property ownership, a broad-based profit sharing, or employee stock ownership plan.
Would that be a little hard to get through in the current context? By people who have big pockets, very deep pockets,
look,
laying it up on the table of our Congress people?
There may be some, certainly there will be opposition to this idea. But presently, what we do, and I think really much in violation of a lot of the economic policies of the founders, is we give out tax incentives almost like
candy.
Well, I'm going to say like directionless, meaning that the Homestead Act, the Louisiana Purchase, the Northwest Ordinance, these were intended to broaden property ownership. We give out tax incentives which don't have the intention to broaden property ownership idea there. It has been lost in our contemporary history from the founders' notion. And I'm actually arguing to bring that back. In the book, I talk a lot about James Madison's, in his later career, his criteria for dealing with this. And he says very specifically that the government should favor approaches that would broaden ownership among the middle class.
It was generally felt, wasn't it?
Sure.
At a certain level, it was part of that. Yeah, okay, yeah. And there was lots of land.
So just to wrap up this first one, over an average 5-year period, the federal government spends about $1 trillion of your money, the citizens, giving tax incentives to corporations for accelerated depreciation, technology expense, all kinds of things. And what I'm saying is corporations should be able to continue to receive these if they have a broad-based profit sharing.
Would you need a political context that could put some meat into that? Or
sure.
You'd have to overcome an awful lot of vested interest.
The political context is chapter 1 of our book called The American Vision. And it's available on the book website, the Citizens Share. People can go and read it. The second tax idea that I would do would be to reform 162M. Now you say, why am I bringing up something so...
Yeah, it sounds arcane, but spell it out.
So arcane.
Yeah, it's important.
You might not remember, but during the election where President Clinton and Al Gore ran for executive office, they had a book called Putting People First, in which they talked about limiting corporate deductions for executive pay to $1 million. And what their hope was that they were arguing a populist issue about executive greed and such. Sometimes I think this can be exaggerated. So ultimately, when Clinton became president, when President Clinton took on the presidency, as this wound through the Congress, and I'm not sure that Clinton and Gore ultimately were aware of how this ended up, it became Internal Revenue Code 162M, which said that, yes, corporations could only deduct up to $1 million from corporate income for tax purposes of the fixed pay of executives. But then it went on to add something that I think was unintended, I hope was unintended, that corporations could get unlimited tax deductions for profit sharing and employee ownership, stock options and stock plans for their top 5 executives, unlimited tax deductions.
For their top 5 executives.
Unlimited. And this is for stock market companies. Since the second year of the Clinton administration,
go ahead.
One can wonder how. Since the second year of the Clinton administration, this has cost, and now it's 6 administrations, 2 Clintons, 2 Bush, and 2 President Obama. This has cost the citizens of the United States $5 to $15 billion a year.
Good grief.
Right? This is over 6 administrations in tax expenditures. Probably more money than was spent on the entire Iraq and Afghanistan war.
Wow.
And what does this do? What this means is that when Corporation X gives a $50 million profit sharing payment to their CEO, which they have a right to do, they get a tax deduction for that. You, the citizens, are actually subsidizing the executive pay of top 5 executives. Now, I want to be very clear. I think that corporations should be able to pay their top 5 executives whatever they want. But I do not think...
Nothing should come out of the taxpayers.
I don't think the taxpayers should actually... Most taxpayers don't understand they're subsidizing it.
And
I talk about this Rule 162M, and I've been trying to educate Washington about it. So what is the reform I'd like to see? The reform I'd like to see is that corporations... You can have unlimited tax deductions for executive pay plans as long as you have a broad-based profit sharing or employee stock ownership plan. If you're willing to have shares broadly, then you can have these deductions.
But you say it's limited to only 5.
No, I'm saying the deductions are limited to the only 5.
Yeah.
Let me be clear again. What I'm saying is that corporations can continue to get these deductions for the top 5 if they have a broad-based profit sharing or employee ownership plan for all their workers.
Okay.
And this is in line with the principles used by many of the founders in their land policies, which is that, like the Homestead Act, they wanted citizens broadly to get broad ownership of property.
Right.
Now, a third reform
that's interesting. Is that along about the same time that it was Mr. Clinton who put the death knell to the Glass-Steagall Act that had been done to separate?
Right, that happened around the same time.
Parcel of that same time frame?
That happened during that same time frame. But this is not my area of expertise, so I don't want to. I don't really want to get into that. Another, I think, important tax reform, which is quite significant, has to do with stock options. We hear a lot of concern about top executives having most of the stock options in companies. Actually, the data is different than the popular view.
Okay.
On average, about 20 to 30% of stock options are in the top 5 executives, and the other 70 to 80% are in just a few percentage points of managers and professionals, just below them.
Yeah, just below them. It goes to the top. The cream goes to the top.
Yeah. And so a number of years ago, the federal government changed the law. I'm not going to get into it on stock option expensing, and as a result of this, a lot of high technology companies abandoned broad-based stock options. So I'd like to see a tax credit for corporations that give stock options to all their employees, including to their executives. That is, treat all their employees like their executives with stock options.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
Because what happened is when
go ahead. I'm sorry.
When the federal government changed the rules on the expensing of stock options, which is a complicated accounting thing, a lot of companies abandoned broad-based stock options, and we actually went backwards. The number of employees, professional employees, managerial employees, middle-class workers in Silicon Valley who had broad-based stock options in tech companies fell by over 35%. So one of the things I'm saying is we need to reverse that. Another thing we need to do is expand the ability of employee stock ownership plans to be adopted in stock market companies. Okay.
In stock market
companies. So here in the United States, here in New York, we have the NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange. They have about 5,000 companies, publicly traded stock market companies. We used to have proposals. We used to have laws which encouraged these companies to have broad-based employee ownership plans. Okay, and those laws were done away with by the Clinton and the first Bush administration.
Why?
They were doing it to as part of deficit reduction to save some billions of dollars. There were some excesses in some of these laws that could have been tightened up, but they really just threw the baby out with the bath.
That happened,
so I'd like to see the following situation: that if a bank loans money to a big publicly traded company to set up an employee stock ownership plan to distribute stock to all of its workers, that bank can get a tax deduction for its interest income and hopefully give a lower interest rate to the company setting up the employee ownership plan. So there are things that we could do. These are just a few examples. I don't want to bore people with too many of these technical details, but what the book does is the book provides a history of all of the policy ideas that the federal government has used on shares from the American Revolution to present. And it ends with 10 ideas that would turn our economic policy towards shares.
Now, what is it that stands in the way of our achieving that? Politically, public relations-wise, public understanding, general understanding of it, and the political process itself?
Excuse me. I think...
you know what I'm saying?
Yes. In terms of political process, I think an economic policy based on shares, first of all, it would not be... a utopia would not solve all of our problems. It would be a responsible, prudent, additional thing to do to address the coring out of the middle class.
Okay,
but
okay,
I think
yeah.
the politically, I actually think it could be a very positive policy. I think Republicans and Democrats could come together to support tax incentives to support shares, because from a Republican point of view, one could make the argument this is making more people capitalists, property owners. James Madison made this argument. They support the economic system.
And don't forget Louis Kelso, who we're referencing, wrote a book called The Capitalist Manifesto.
Exactly.
It wasn't called Karl Marx Socialism.
No, this is
so
straight.
and you want to have something that is going to be able to appeal to both the private sector, public sector dialogue that is there, and one that's going to include them both, and not one wiping out the other, which is all together too much part of the popular rhetoric against the injustices that are being felt throughout society.
Precisely. And from the Democratic perspective, this could be viewed as addressing inequality practically by asset building and expanding property ownership, and seen as broader social and economic justice. It's all through private property ownership, all through the tax system. It's not redistribution. Now, one issue that, would have to be addressed, especially with employee stock ownership, is you want to be careful about excessively risky forms of employee stock ownership, as we found in Enron, where Enron encouraged employees, and people want to see the Enron film that they can rent and see. There's shots of Enron executives actually telling employees, sink as much of your money as you can in your 401k plan. Workers buying company stock with their savings or wages excessively in their 401k plan, as Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize on these issues of behavioral finance, has taught us, that's not a good idea. I'm talking about policies to encourage cash profit sharing, which is low risk, grants of stock to workers through ESOPs and stock options and restricted stock plans, where workers are not buying the stock. Let's be clear. In an employee stock ownership plan, workers do not buy the stock with their wages or savings. So I'm saying lower risk employee ownership plans and lower risk profit sharing plans. That's what we should encourage.
What about the idea that Lewis had? If I understand it, he would have the general theory, like Keynes had a general theory, and so there's Federal Reserve, and there's the that, and then he had one thing that he wanted added to the national picture, the governmental picture, is a capital diffusion reinsurance corporation to give reinsuring capability to a casualty insurance industry that could, particularly with things where you've got in investment, you have feasibility studies going on by the pros and all that sort of thing, but you do have a thing called venture, where some things are much more risky than others.
Sure.
But there should be an insurance that the risk could be dealt with through a casualty insurance industry that could be backed up by the Capital Diffusion Reinsurance Corporation within the federal structure next to the Federal Reserve. It could be a way in which you could get reinsuring to make sure those things that are getting income to the people, not in some big crapshoot or something where you're going to make a big breakthrough, but for the masses of the people, infrastructure and things like that are so solid that they could be able to bring other people in on the ownership that is going to realize productive capability maybe only 5 or 6 years into the future.
Sure.
Get them in touch with the future in general, the society. Is there anything wrong with that, and why hasn't that been able to be instituted within the federal structure? What are the political things that have made it not possible for that vision to become part of the national pattern that's being advanced by our political leadership?
Well, it's a long question. I want to try to break it down
Fine.
a little bit.
All right,
and I'll break it down in this way. Various points in my life, I've owned a diversified mutual fund of bonds, that support hospitals and public works and such. And one can purchase mutual funds which have insured public bonds, where they actually buy insurance.
Okay.
So too. I think you are correct. Imagine that we have 5,000 public companies that dominate the stock market, and then we have about 1 million small businesses that really dominate the main street of America.
Right.
Imagine that there were many of these businesses employee stock ownership plans of about 20%, and some of these businesses were majority or 100% owned by their ESOPs. You could imagine that these companies could buy an insurance policy to some extent on to insure against certain levels of risk.
Well, yeah, and then you could have reinsuring. You could have a reinsuring function of the federal government to back up or reinsure the risk-taking of the casualty insurance companies that could be offering that security to those things that people are dependent upon, and not leave it all up to venture mentality. That everything is going to be a big crapshoot. Everybody's going to shoot for the things that it'd be a little bit left over for the risk, but for the things that are really giving security to the mass of the people, that could be vouchsafed within a system that would include this reassuring capability, the faith and credit of the United States. I think that was Lewis's intent.
I think it requires a little bit more thought because we have to be honest and straightforward about this, that we've just come through a period where we had a massive financial collapse.
I know, it's horrible.
Caused by credit default swaps, which otherwise are attempts to insure
that's
dumb,
AIG.
just a second, it's not only AIG, to insure dumb and risky mortgage-backed securities. So I'm just trying to say, we'd have to I think that requires more thought.
Yeah, but let me make a point. That was within the federal structure he was talking, not within the private sector.
Right.
It was the private International Swaps and Derivatives Association private sector.
That's right.
They were the ones watching the hen coop. The private sector. It would be within the government thing in terms of the structure, and it didn't seem to get established within the federal structure, the United States government federal structure, is what I'm saying, is the way I think he meant it to be, to Lewis.
Well, I'd like to give it more thought, but I think it is possible to have insurance products that help broad-based property ownership go further. And in fact,
and the less the risk, the lower can be the premiums and so forth. And most of the things that are infrastructure, it's not a big rescue. They're trying to make it be all a great big crapshoot where I'm going to make $1 billion all at once and everything. And that's only part of the venture, a risk pattern that is characteristic of the economy. It should be isolated at the top for a few, but not for the whole damned economy.
No, that is true in terms of ownership.
Yeah.
But the important general point here is that we need to come up with economic policies that broaden property ownership in companies of all types and sizes, stock market, non-stock market, and for citizens who are not workers in private sector companies. Going back to my solar energy and wind turbine farm example. And general, the whole society at various levels of very little risk, And going back to your first two questions, one was what's blocking this? Another issue blocking this is lack of awareness.
Thank you.
Another, and hopefully your program and the citizens educating themselves about these ideas will help that.
It'd be good if it would be on a couple of the national programs of our political parties that could bring it up, or in the intellectual community in general could bring it up. They're falling down on the job.
Well, citizens can read a variety of books about these ideas, go on the internet, learn from responsible organizations about these ideas, and then bring them up in their political parties, and also bring them up to their government officials. I think that another thing blocking this is academia.
I know.
In business schools, in economics departments, in social science departments, in public policy schools, there's not enough discussion of these ideas. The two extremist views predominate in these schools. One is against the government role, try to reduce the government as much as possible, which has its place within reason. Another one, try to expand the government role.
to take over everything.
But these two views oftentimes ignore, as I said, this other view in American history of spreading broad-based property ownership. And
it's a new idea.
Yeah, it's a new idea. We need it. We need in
That's
business.
what we need. Yeah.
We need in business schools to have cases, case studies. People have heard about the Harvard Business School using case study methods. We need to have case studies dealing with companies that have broad-based profit sharing, broad-based employee ownership. There's a wonderful website called caseplace.org.
Caseplace, CASEPLACE.org.
That has a special section of it on employee stock ownership plans with case studies on these kinds of companies. Examples like I've given here, Google, Procter & Gamble, and such. There's a wonderful film which has recently come out.
That's just come out now.
Right. It's
Let's
called
talk about
We the Owners. And reviewers can look at it. I was an advisor on the film. It's called We the Owners. They have a website, www.wetheowners.com, in which citizens can go and look at examples of 3 different companies that are owned in different ways by their employees or have some kind of profit share.
It's a very well put together film. It's I think it's really.
So you've seen it, right?
I have seen it, I think it's a very well put together film, and it's the 3 companies and the advantages of this kind of thing, and it goes into a lot of questions that people are concerned with. I congratulate them on putting that film together. Recommend it along with your book.
Now there is a. There have been proposals, for example, by Thomas Piketty, who's a professor at a university, a French university in Paris, that you're not going to really solve this problem. And this was recently a subject of a New York Times article by Thomas Edsall, Edsall, here in New York, that you're not going to solve this problem of economic inequality except by having a global tax on wealth. So that
like a Tobin tax?
Not Tobin. Global tax
on wealth
across the whole world on wealth. But
Robbie Batra used to talk about that too.
As I read about this, Professor Piketty also says that this global tax is likely not to be politically feasible. You're likely not to get it passed.
The politics is a
and
problem.
then the other question that I would raise is, can you get it passed all over the world? Because you don't want people then to go to countries which don't have the global tax, like corporations, went to certain states that had lower taxes. There's no question in my mind that there are 2 big solutions to the economic inequality problem. One is a massive expansion of the tax system. Another is a massive expansion of what I will call the private share system. I think it's more likely that we would see a combination of the 2. I would like to see most of economic inequality addressed through the share system with a fair, just social safety net supported by taxes. But it is my view that I think that economic inequality is so severe right
and
now,
the trends are unsettling.
I don't think we can completely tax our way out of it. And I'm especially concerned, and I especially make this point about not being able to completely tax our way out of it, because if you imagine this world where a lot of the productiveness does come from robots, and we have reduced work hours. Really, what you want is you want to have people who still have enough economic literacy to manage their wealth and manage their property.
Or to have a system where they wouldn't have to manage it so much, because actually I think there's something to be said for the fact that we're coming to an end point, and that what's really before us is the potential, just as there's a potential. Do you think, have you looked at modeling, I don't know if you have or not, that the weapon systems that have developed, have you paid attention to the weapon systems that have developed, Gatling gun and everything, and the realpolitik notion of politics is whoever got the club can hit the other on the head and do whatever they want and then co-opt and everything like that, that notion, those weapon systems have become apparently, since about 1970, species lethal.
Well, sure.
No, we were protected in our impotence at the level of species.
I'm very concerned about the spread of war and the spread of societal violence. It's not my expertise.
The social integration that would come that might set off that nonsense that would allow us to stop the evolution of consciousness.
Well,
no, I mean, it has never been possible. So what we want to get at is a sense, this is not your normal time. This is not 17 years of the 18th century. This is something very, very different that we're being confronted with now. And on the right side, on the other side of that vector, that destructive, I think the Trident submarines could do it by themselves. And they don't have a policy that can bring. And on the other side is, I don't think it should be just laughed off. That we may have, at the level of capability, every day, Joseph, comes a revolution from every field in terms of producing capability. Nanotechnology is just over the accord. You're going to have building materials that are 1,000 times stronger than steel and weigh nothing. There's all kinds of capabilities that are coming, and it may not be so inappropriate to say collectively, human society within an ecological order has transcended material scarcity as an ontologic design problem.
So let me comment on this.
So then, if that's the case, why isn't it up on the table? Why is it never discussed? They're just reifying outdated institutions that have occurred in one condition, and they haven't got the vision to a new system that is transcendent in a large evolutionary sense, not just a political sense.
Well, let me comment on this. I think, obviously, I'm not an expert on weapon systems, but I do think that if the levels of economic inequality keep spinning out of control, and the concentration, just a second, and the concentration of wealth and income increases, I do think that we get to a feudalism stage, and at that point, I think we see all kinds of problems of political instability, economic instability, and social instability,
which could set off the Gauda Ramadan.
Well, I don't know about that, but that I think is hard to address by continuously ramping up your welfare system. It goes back to our chapter 1, which is the founders thought that if you had, to the extent you had broad-based property ownership and you had more economic liberty, you would have a more settled population supportive of a representative republic.
I wish we had a trend toward that, don't you, on a world scale?
I would like to see
I would like to see that very thing emerge, so that we can liberate or we can annihilate our species. We're at that kind of a crossroads now, in my way of thinking. And we need something that's going to make it possible for the former rather than the latter, it seems to me.
I'd like to see a number of countries in here in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia move towards what I would call inclusive capitalism, financial inclusion, broad-based property ownership, using the policy ideas in the book. These ideas are not just isolated to the United States. They're being discussed by the European. The European
by the
Parliament,
Chinese and the Indians and
well, you know, we do see a limited phenomenon in China that in some of their technology companies using broad-based stock options, using some broad-based employee ownership. I don't want to exaggerate it. We don't know enough about it, but we'd like to see some countries like the United States, and England is now in this position, serve as a bit of a model. And you can do this. As I said, we have this large ESOP sector here in the United States.
That's true. That's true.
10 million workers and 10, 11 million workers, 11,000 companies. That is kind of a model. One question that I'm concerned about is, I think the TV viewers need to
let me just warn you, we only got about 3 minutes or so left, so let's get it down to haiku.
Okay, so getting it down to haiku is there social and economic research which suggests that small businesses with 20% employee ownership, or Procter & Gamble's with 30% employee ownership, or Google's with broad-based stock options can perform as acceptably as the non-share economy. And there certainly is, and we provide the evidence in the book.
Yeah, really good. And that new film that's out,
yes,
too.
And the new film with the owners.
Yeah.
The big picture, though, I think we need to say, is that the fixed wage system in the United States, which used to be, after World War II, the source of great wealth, has essentially collapsed.
Yeah, I'm afraid.
It cannot be the source of wealth.
Yeah.
The only way we're going to be able to have a middle class is if we have middle class citizens with access to capital ownership and capital income. And the only way we're going to do that is make the U.S. tax system encourage corporations to have broad-based profit sharing, employee ownership plans, and broad property plans for citizens who are not workers in companies.
Very well said, and I think that might make it possible for there to be like a leisured part of the human scenario where they could pay attention to things that really matter, rather than defending a niche within corporate capitalism or something. They could be concerned with things that matter, like, say, the arts and the sciences and the things and the education in a broad general sense, and the family life and that kind of thing. A life that is really capable of being lived fully, rather than just being a wage slave within a system that's outdated. That whole system is outdated. We need a vision toward that. We don't seem to have it. Maybe it's emerging. Your book and the new film might help.
Well, my hope is that broader-based property ownership, reduced economic inequality, is a better economy for children. It's a better economy for families, for parents, for families of all kinds, for communities of all kinds.
May be appropriate to a liberated order, which is the promise of the time in which we live, rather than a continued feudalism of slavery that's been the characteristic. Unfortunately, Daedalus did have, Daedalus say, Shakespeare say, history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken. In a very real sense, we're awakening maybe to a new liberated order that is that we're privileged and cursed to be born into. And if anything's going to help us get there, it might be your book, if I would say.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'm not a utopian, but I think there's possible to have a slightly better society.
Okay, well, that's good. I think that would be good. It's your pleasure. I had the perceptions then of Josep Blasi. We've had an extended conversation with him now. Thank you for viewing. We'll be coming back again tomorrow. And thank you, Joseph, for all the good work.
You're welcome.
And everything.
Thank you for your attention.
And for the new book, and again, it's called
Citizens Share.
The Citizens Share. And
Yale University Press.
Out now, and then also the film we ought to book. The film,
it's called WeTheOwners.com.
WeTheOwners.com. They can go on the site and find reference to that film. Also, it's a major film for taking some of these ideas and putting into a filming. We'd be interested in that here in television. So, thank you very much for all that.
Welcome.
We're coming back tomorrow, and
Good
thanks
night,
for viewing. Okay, very good. Well,